welcome everybody on behalf of the Prince Albert Historical Society. It's nice to see you all. I'm amazed anybody would come inside on an afternoon like this in September, late September, but here we all are. So I want to welcome Karin Stueber today. She's not the person that was on the poster, but she is the supervisor of the person who was on the poster. So she's here to talk about the archaeology project at Fort Carlton, particularly to do with Métis women.
Yes, I'm going to touch on some of Sarah's.
So I'm excited to hear what you have to say. There's coffee. Not while she's talking, but afterwards there's lots of coffee, and so we welcome you to look around the museum if you want to after as well. So thank you. And
thank you very much. Thank you everyone for having me today. Apologies again to Sarah. She sends her regrets. Unfortunately, she was called away on field work, but I did make her promise that she would come back and do a presentation specifically on all the things she learned while writing her Master of Arts thesis. So we can definitely guilt her into doing that. As Connie said, my name is Karin Stueber. I'm the Executive Director of the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society. We've been up in Prince Albert this weekend hosting our 62nd annual gathering, and this is the final event, which I'm happy to present, but I'm also happy to go home and have some sleep after a very long weekend. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional territory of the Niihau, the Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, the Naka, the Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This land is situated in Treaty 6 territory, and it has long been a place of gathering, teaching, and stewardship by Indigenous peoples. As we discuss archaeology and the history of this land, we recognize the deep ongoing connections that Indigenous communities have to these places and the knowledge they hold. We commit to approaching this work with respect, humility, and a spirit of collaboration. Right, Tim? So I should have told you to flip, no worries. So this is a lovely picture from the Duck Lake Interpretive Center. We found in their archives a photo of the signatories of Treaty 6 in 1876 at Fort Carlton there.
Can we kill the lights just for a second so we can see? You can kill the lights permanently.
Okay, there we go.
I have my pictures. I signaled her, but she didn't see me. Oh, okay.
All right, so yeah.
It's supposed to be out. I just made them fair.
So yeah, these were the signatories of Treaty 6 that was held at Fort Carlton on August 23rd, 1876. So pretty great to have that photo there. All right, so who am I? As I mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society. I am a settler born and raised on Treaty 6 territory, which is huge. That extends all the way from where we are today over into Alberta. I grew up just west of Edmonton, got interested in archaeology in my youth, did my undergraduate degree at the University of Alberta, and I was going to be an Egyptologist. Right? I was in love with pyramids and mummies until I did my field school at a site near the tiny town, or ghost town now, of Bodo, Alberta. So you may have heard about Bodo Bison Skull site in the news. They have a little interpretive center there. And that's when I fell in love with Indigenous and Canadian archaeology. Who needs pyramids and monumental architecture when you have thousands of years of human history right where you grew up, right? That people have lived on this land and thrived for thousands upon thousands of years since time immemorial. So from that point, I switched my focus. So even though I still have a classics minor, and I do enjoy archaeology worldwide, I decided to focus on looking at stone tools. So I came to the University of Saskatchewan, which really is the place to go if you wanted to do Canadian archaeology on the prairies. And there I did a master's degree with Dr. David Meyer on a pebble chert quarry site near Consort, Alberta. I convinced Dr. Ernie Walker to do a PhD, and that I took my love of rocks and stone tools, and I went a little bit deeper, super scientific, geochemical characterizations of brown chalcedony during the Basant-Sonota period. I basically like rocks that look like beer bottle glass, and that I think you can find it in multiple areas. It's not all just coming from North Dakota, which is what we previously thought. So I've been involved with archaeology for a few years, both university-led research projects in Alberta and Saskatchewan. I really am enjoying the community-led research projects I've been involved in here in Saskatchewan with different Indigenous nations. Wapayton, Pheasant Rump, now Cody First Nation, to name a few. I have worked as a consultant in cultural resource management for a brief period of time, but I didn't get that interaction with community, nor did I get the research aspect very much. And I've also taught university classes, which I love telling people of all ages, whether they're university students, little 5-year-olds, to 99 years plus, all about archaeology and how fascinating I feel my profession is. All right, Tim? Yeah, it's easier just to click it there. All right, so just a little bit about the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society, who we are. We say we're connecting Saskatchewan's past to you. So we deal with the entire timeline of human history in the province, since Indigenous peoples, back in their days, since time immemorial, up to settler era, historic period, settlement, industrial archaeology. Our purpose is that we support people in physical and cultural communities in stewarding archaeological heritage for our collective well-being. We can learn so much about the past, and it enriches our lives. Our core values are reconciliation, equity, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion, which is fundamental to what we do and why we exist. And we are committed to robust, evidence-informed decision-making and sound stewardship of our purpose and all of our resources through good governance. So we serve our membership, which is in and around 300 people, the people in our 7 chapters located throughout the province, which includes the Prince Albert Historical Society, students of all ages, and people in Saskatchewan in general. We also serve interested people outside of Saskatchewan. We do get, a lot of information from our colleagues in Alberta and Manitoba, because the provincial borders and even the federal ones are just modern constructs, right? In the past, these borders didn't exist. And future generations. So one of the things the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society has been doing for decades now, I would say, is we've offered field school programs, and we've put them into 2 types, so excavation and survey programs. So excavation usually take place at known archaeological sites around the province, while surveying field schools are a bit more ad hoc and take place at various locations. The type of field schools involve surveying the landscape for archaeological sites and artifacts, and then recording anything that we come across. So this could be stone cairns, teepee rings, any kind of things like effigies or medicine wheels. We would like to record them if they haven't previously been recorded, and what we then do is we do what's called a Saskatchewan Archaeological Resource Record. So it's basically a form that we submit to the provincial regulators of archaeology at the Heritage Conservation Branch in Regina, and they maintain a provincial database of all known archaeological sites. And this helps researchers who want to know more about what archaeology is and where it is, but also anytime development occurs, so whether this is pipelines, potash mines, uranium mines, forestry, roadways, you have to get an assessment done to determine if there's archaeology in that area, and that could potentially be impacted by proposed development. So knowing where sites are helps them determine whether or not development can occur there. So that's one of the things we like to do. And we like to teach people how to, if they're out on the land and they find something, how to record and report it as well. All right, so both field school types are for anyone. Our members, we often have had school excavations where we'll partner with a school division and they'll bring out grades. We like grades 4 to 8 because archaeology tends to fit into that curriculum. But we'll take younger kids too, we'll take high school kids, whatever. We're not picky in that way. And we also encourage the general public to come out, like usually on weekends, because that's when it tends to work more for everybody. Families come out. I've had multiple generations come out, grandparents, their kids, and their grandkids, and they're all digging together, and it's great to see that. And they just get a chance, right, to spend the day together and do something new and interesting. The one good thing that we benefit from by doing these field schools is our employment program. So it gives us the opportunity to hire summer students and interns. So they're usually university students, undergrad or graduate level students. They tend to work for us from anywhere from 14 to 16 weeks throughout the summer. The museum probably does a 2 through the Young Canada Works program, right? It's what all museums and cultural organizations tend to access that level of funding for. And it gives them the opportunity to develop their skills, usually in terms of public outreach, but also in doing the field schools, they get more experience doing excavation and surveying and site recording. Since 2016, we now have an internship program, which allows us to hire recent graduates for up to 6 months. They get paid a higher wage, and they're usually for special projects. So we recently did our Points of View book publication, and we hired an intern to basically design the layout of the book, and she's actually the credited author on it, or the editor. So training for students and the public, skills development, GPS and map reading, excavation methodology, field experience, all of that is, everybody learns from it. We also do professional development seminars for social studies teachers. We did do one for Sask Parks for their summer interpreters, because if you're out in the provincial parks, you're probably going to encounter archaeology in one way or another. I know for sure with down on Lake Diefenbaker, there's always archaeology getting washed ashore or eroding out, and their park staff has to deal with it. And they need to know what they need to do when somebody brings that to them. And then we have volunteer opportunities at our office in Saskatoon. So working with collections, analyzing the things that we've excavated from the field schools, working on projects as well, all that kind of stuff. So how we do our field schools, whether it's excavation or survey, is usually based on requests. So whether it's from an individual, like the Far Site excavations, which was an avocational archaeologist who kept telling us we need to do something with the site, to organizations like the Humboldt Museum that's had us come out to original Humboldt, or community that has an interest. So now George Gordon First Nation has expressed interest in archaeological sites near their lands. So we're working with them to do archaeological surveying. Okay. So the programs can get, I wouldn't say complex, but we like to give people as much information as possible prior to coming out to site, but also during as well. So we usually have a participant booklet. These are the ones from the Fort Carlton one in 2021, which basically what to expect. What is it like being at an archaeological site? Safety. Please don't wear flip-flops. You'll probably trip. And especially when working on a historic site, we don't need you stepping on a rusty nail and getting tetanus. So things like that, what to bring, the common artifact types that they may encounter, how, basically a bare bones, how to excavate your unit that you get, What do you do when you find things? How do you measure things? How do you screen things? And then why we care about all that information. Because once we excavate a site, we destroy it. So properly recording everything we find and where we find it helps us reconstruct the site later on, right? It gives us the most amount of information so we can properly interpret what's going on. So it's paperwork. The kids all think, oh, it's fun, let's go dig. You've got to do paperwork too, kids. You know, but you can draw maps though, so that's fun. When we do have the school program, we like to do classroom visits beforehand, get the kids really jazzed up about it. During COVID, we did videos, so we zoomed them in. We split the day into morning and afternoon sessions, so we have one group in the morning and one group in the afternoon, because we found having one group for the whole day, it's too much for them. You can excavate for a few hours and then it's like it's time for something else. And then additional activities outside of excavation, right? Sometimes when you get large groups of people, we don't have enough space for them all to excavate at the same time, so we split them into groups. So one group will go and do spear hunting or the atlatl at our bison target, and then they'll switch out with the digging group, and then usually at the end we have them all come together and play a classroom version of Trappers and Traders, our fur trade card game. So other things we talk about with people is what is archaeology, what provincial archaeology is, the legislation behind it, how we have to abide by the Heritage Property Act that exists, and that requires us to not only take out permits and do those site forms, but then to do a permit report and report on everything we did, how we did it, why we did it that way, what we found, what we think is going on. With school-age children, careers in archaeology, and some people think it's like, you're never going to get a job in that. That's a nice pursuit if you're rich. And it's like, no, we actually do get paid to do this. We won't make millions, but you can make a living from it. We talk about cultural chronology and artifact types, the differences between ecofacts, features, and sites. So basically, your archaeology 101. Okay. What we've done now too is to help teachers even more is to tie it into the Saskatchewan curriculum. So we've got all the indicators and outcomes for the field school program, so teachers can justify why they need school funding to bring their kid out on site, because we're meeting all these outcomes and indicators. So this is all available online under our educational resources for teachers. Okay, next. So this is the research projects the SAS has been involved in going back to the 60s. A lot of it collaboratively with organizations like the Royal Saskatchewan Museum and the University of Saskatchewan, but also national organizations like Parks Canada, and then even consulting companies like Stantec and Western Heritage at places like Hudson Bay and the original Humboldt Telegraph Station. So a lot of it is collaborative. We can share resources. Ones we've kind of taken the forefront on are Camp Rainier down near Hitchcock's Bay, Lemsford Ferry Teepee Ring, Little Manitou is a survey as well. St. Victor's Petroglyphs, we've worked with them. Tramping Lake area survey over around Plenty and Herschel. South Branch House, which we were there for quite a long time, and I think 3 or 4 master's theses came out of that. Herschel and Plenty, we went back and did some site recording there. The far site, which I mentioned down near Ogama, so down in there, which is the oldest intact archaeological site in the province to date, barring what's going on with Sturgeon Lake, where it was. So that dates to Cody Complex. It's in a cultivated field, but there's actually archaeological site underneath the cultivation layer. And we have bison bone with 9,000 to 10,000 year old projectile points together. and so that's been dated. Fort Carlton, which I'm going to talk about shortly. And then this here that popped up onto my plate was a survey of the Wolverine pasture south of Humboldt, along just north of Highway 16. Okay. All right, so Fort Carlton. In 2021, the SAS began excavations as part of a proposed 3-year partnership with Saskatchewan Provincial Parks and the University of Saskatchewan's Department of Anthropology to provide archaeological field experience to the general public as well as post-secondary students at Fort Carlton. The site area is known as Pehonanak, a Cree name meaning the waiting place. It was an area occupied and used as such long before the development of the Canadian fur trade. In 1810, the Hudson's Bay Company built Carleton House, which later became known as Fort Carlton on the North Saskatchewan River Terrace that now houses a reconstructed fort and provincial park area. And you can see that here's our reconstructed fort, and this is an aerial shot, and the river is just to the north of it there. So it's about a quarter mile from the river itself. Fort Carlton can be segmented into 5 major building phases, all of which are located on that river terrace. The construction, rebuilding, and fixing were almost constant as the wood was untreated and prone to damage and rot. The first phase spans from 1810 to 1821, when the Hudson's Bay Company post Carleton and the Northwest Company post La Montée shared a common stockade, which was square in shape and just large enough to house the trading store and a few other buildings. Around 1818, the Northwest Company moved La Montée across the river and upstream. In 1821, we had the merger of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company into the bigger Hudson's Bay Company now. The workers then tore down the old Northwest Company post and reused some of the materials to rebuild a larger stockade to encompass the fact that they've got more people all within the same area. The third phase from 1835 to 1855 actually was not square, but hexagonal, which is kind of weird for a fur trade post. And then in 1855, the post was entirely rebuilt again. The last phase dates from 1868 to 1885 and includes 2 big changes. One season was spent working on expanding the northern wall, and another season was spent expanding the southern wall to accommodate the addition of Northwest Mounted Police and Indian Agency workers after the 1876 Treaty 6 signing. And we all know what happened to Fort Carlton in 1885 as the Northwest Mounted Police were fleeing from the Battle of Duck Lake back to Fort Carlton into their lovely palisaded fort, which this reconstruction represents. Somebody knocked over a lamp, set fire to all the straw in the bedding, and whoosh, up goes the fort. So everybody in the fort took off, headed up here to Prince Albert instead, and the fort was never rebuilt after that point. So official archaeological investigations to relocate Fort Carlton for future reconstruction began in 1964 under the supervision of Anthony Rainier. However, in the early 1900s, what was his first name? Morton's first name?
Oh, Arthur.
Arthur Silva Morton, thank you. Was actually, he went around, he was a historian. He went around and was trying to relocate all these fur trade sites, and he was the first to relocate the 1885 fort at what is now known as Fort Carlton. So one of the things we did when we came here and after we were approached by Sask Parks and partnered with the University of Saskatchewan is we reached out to Beardy's and Okamesa's Cree Nation, who were happy to be involved, happy to potentially have their schools come out and take part. Now, this is still in the height of COVID, so there was a lot of social distancing going on and trying to make sure we weren't unintentionally infecting each other. So it was a little bit of a logistical nightmare. However, we did hold the first pipe ceremony at the fort since 1876 to open up that field season with good intentions. And we had a feast after that way. So this was a planned 3-year project. It did host 3 university field schools. It had over 50 members of the public take part, so school children as well. It employed about 10 students through the SAS, which was fantastic, and we can see some of them up there. That is from our first field season, so we have Nathaniel, Sarah Pocha-Tait right there, myself in the middle, so that's the Sarah we dislike right now because she didn't make it today, but she will be back. Alicia Reeser, that was their first official field school. That's where Sarah really got a sense of her family's connection to Fort Carlton, which I'll talk about. The man on the end with the hat was Felipe Gomez, who was a Saskatchewan wanderer for a while, so we made him come out. And then we have Lauren and Faith, who were our summer students at the time too. And we actually hired Alicia, Sarah, and Nathaniel as summer students as well. From this 3 years of work, there are 3 Master of Arts theses, one of which being Sarah's, which is almost complete. Another one on the faunal or the bone remains from the 2021 excavations was just finished last year by Alexis Hunter. And so we have one more faunal thesis in progress by a former field school student. Okay. All right, these are some great photos I borrowed from Sarah's thesis that she sourced. A historic photo of Fort Carlton dated to 1871, so prior to the burning of the fort, and then a sketch of Fort Carlton probably in and around the same time period there. So, Arthur Silver Norton found the place early 1900s. It wasn't until 64 that Anthony Rainier got money to help in his excavations leading up to Canada's centennial in 1967. So there was a lot of funding to kind of show the first 100 years of nation building, and that's where a lot of that National Historic Sites were relocated and expanded upon as a result of that. So Rainier benefited from that. His investigations ran from 1964 to 67, and they were able to locate that last fort phase from 1868 to 1885. They identified all the internal buildings and the extent of the fort's palisade walls. And then what they actually did is they kind of capped certain intact foundations, so they're under cement now, and then rebuilt the reconstruction right on top of that. And that's what you see in Visit today. Subsequent excavations took place throughout the 70s and the 90s in order to locate the Chief Factor's residence, which is where the Interpretive Center stands today, as well as anytime infrastructure upgrades happened, when they put a water line in, when they upgraded the parking lot, they had to do archaeological assessment because it's Fort Carlton. You know there's going to be archaeology there. So there's the odd project from those periods. So when we were approached in 2019, the idea was to kick off, but then COVID happened, so it was pushed back for another year. But it's okay, in the end, we still got out there. Next. All right. So this is an overview of all 3 years of excavations. What we wanted to do is, well, you know the 1885 fort exists because they built a reconstruction on top of it. Then there's this west field. Now, Rainier, he did a little bit of investigative work in there. He actually took they trenched like a linear path straight out to the fence line to see if they'd hit any kind of artifacts or foundations. But as far as we know, the rest of this whole area had never been touched by archaeologists. So it's like, well, what's there? We know this is the 1885 fort. What about those earlier building phases? Can we relocate them? Because they weren't built all on the same spot. Some of them kind of overlapped, which, now saying that, we really should have realized it might have been like a dog's breakfast trying to separate out the different fort phases, but we were keen. So the first year, because it was COVID, instead of doing a whole bunch of units all in one spot, we spread everybody out, which is great because you can cover a large area, but it doesn't really help when it comes to interpretation, right? Because we're so far removed. So the university had their ground penetrating radar unit come out, teach the students how to use that. They ran transects with the GPR over certain areas. They came up with anomalies, whether this was just, actual evidence of building phases or disturbance. This place is riddled with gopher and badger holes. Like, it's insane. Like, they will come up and watch you excavate. You can be head down in the pit, look up, and there's this gopher staring you in the face. So no fear whatsoever. And they were all like, hey, you're making holes for us, let us help. Right? So they were fun. Cute little buggers, but you wanted to murder them by the end of it. So we have all these green units kind of spread out. And then we found that there were areas of significant activity where we were getting a lot of artifacts coming up. And that's where these blue areas are starting to show up. So this first little blue area there, we thought we had some sort of compressed floor feature. The first year we only had one unit there, and then we basically expanded it into 2 meters by 2 meters. And we're still not entirely sure if it was a floor or if it was something else, because more work needs to be done. We had another area, this big blue block, tons of bones. You'll see pictures in later slides of the amount of faunal remains we recovered from that. So we think it might be a midden feature where they were throwing all their trash. And then that smaller 2 meter by 2 meter block slightly to the north of it, the student got a unit. Smack dab in the middle of her 1 meter unit was this giant stump, 2 feet in diameter, which we thought was really cool. She not so much, because it was hard for her to learn to excavate around it. And it went down a good 4 feet. And we think it might have been a large structural post, maybe for the gate itself. So they're still analyzing those materials, and we're not entirely sure yet. So that's over the 3 years. They put in about 44 units trying to figure out what's going on, what fort phase is it, what kind of artifacts or belongings are coming up from it. They also put in 4 trenches, seeing if they could connect the different areas of excavation, if it was part of maybe a store, like a company store or barracks or something like that. And then we also put in smaller shovel tests kind of around the perimeter or the periphery, just to see if there was anything else out there, and there really wasn't in some of them. So it seems to be really localized to that area with all the blue, but we don't know for sure. So what we did the first year is we would have the university students come into one of the barracks. The park staff made it available for us. We could store all our field equipment out there. We could kind of have on-site lectures. Tim actually gave a lecture about historic artifact identification, because a lot of the students, this was the first time they were encountering things from the 1800s. Okay. So here's just some action shots of the students we've got going. There we have Sarah in the top left, excavating down into a unit. Bree and Raina. Raina is working on the other faunal master's thesis, posing with their unit. We had people just showing up, and then we really encouraged the fort staff too, if somebody comes, don't just keep them back to the reconstructed fort. You know, tell them to come on out into the field and join in, learn, have an up-close look at what's going on there. We have Haley showing a large iron spike that she pulled out of a unit. There's one of the students pulling the ground penetrating radar rig. And then 2 students are actually shovel shading. I really felt bad for them because the GPR said that there was some sort of anomaly about a meter or so down. So we put units right over that anomaly, had them start excavating. Nothing. Okay, you don't have to excavate by trowel anymore and go slow since you're not finding anything. Take out your shovels. Then they hit clay. Whee! They did it. They took it down. So good on them for doing it, and it was part of their field school, so it's all training experience. Okay. Here's some more sites. This is subsequent years, units that we didn't finish in the first year. We would often line them with plastic. All the dirt we had removed gets put back in to help protect them through our lovely freeze-thaw cycles in the winter. So the next year's field school comes out, the first thing they get to do, pull out all the dirt and the plastic again. It's character building. At the end of the day, we would often cover the units just to kind of protect them from the elements, mostly the weather. If it rained, you can see they're bucketing out some water. It doesn't stop the gophers from going into it. And then every morning we started pulling the equipment from the barracks out onto site so we could use it for the day. Okay? Oh, you're gonna hit once. Okay, don't hit the other one yet. So this is just some shots that we have of like fully excavated units at the end of the field season. So this was the big block area, and you can see how dark the ground is here. And then we have all these white patches. So this is ash, and this is all charcoal. So this is a burn layer. You can kind of see the different layers in this pillar as well. And all those white bits sticking out, that's all bison bone. So this is a trash heap that was probably burnt too. It was a mess to dig through, but it's fun. Okay, click. So this is what most of the units kind of look like. Nice sandy soil. The darker bits are just because it was moist that day, so it was a little bit wetter than the surrounding units. This was mostly sand. This white thingy in the center, that was that big stump post. So we knew because there was a big post there, we should probably excavate around it and find it. Okay. And then another shot of what one of the areas, and this one isn't great because of the shadow, but after it's cleaned out. Most areas were pretty sandy, so it was easy and nice to dig through. Some areas, then you get the hard pan clay, and it's a little bit more challenging.
How deep down do you go?
We went, one unit, we went almost 2 meters, and it was still going. But because of occupational health and safety, we can't go more than 2 meters without having to expand it and shore it up. And we didn't have the time to expand, so it's like, okay, this is as far as we can safely go without being illegal. So that's all we're going to do there. The other areas went down about 1 meter or just slightly over 1 meter, 1.5 meters. So one of the interesting things about Fort Carlton, out of all the archaeological sites I've worked on, is organic preservation. All right. Usually things that are organic don't last long unless you have like ideal conditions, like extremely dry or extremely wet or frozen, right? Here, things are going to break down pretty readily over time. So with this, we've got these brown bits. This is a fence line of some sort, of wooden posts. Next. There we see another kind of cross section of the wooden posts in the wall too. So that was kind of neat. It's like, oh, we're running into some sort of barriers, right? Do we think this is palisade walls? No. These are too small. These might be like garden fences or keeping animals out of certain areas. Thanks. That was the part of the post before it came out. So you can see how big that is. Now, preservation was extremely good, but it wasn't perfect. So once you start exposing the wood, it's going to start to dry out and it's going to start to crumble. So oftentimes the wood was left with the surrounding sediment on it, so it didn't deteriorate any further. And when we knew, we could take it out and get it wrapped up and then put into like cold storage so it wouldn't deteriorate any further. That was like really quick, like get it out, go, sort of thing. Many of the wood pieces and the other organic pieces lived in a bar fridge we have at home because we were in wall time, so we were the closest to the fort that we could easily get it into cold to kind of halt any further decay process. Okay, so this is the bone at Fort Carlton in that big block area. This is why it was expanded into, was like 4 meters by 4 meters. So quite a large area. You have just tons of elements from large bovids, more than likely bison, but we might have some evidence in the top left there. We think that might be a calf skull from cattle, right, which isn't unheard of. But I think the majority of what we've got is definitely bison. We have bison scapula. You can see some of the scapula in there, so the shoulder bones, leg bones. We had vertebrae or spine elements. Not much cranial or skulls, but definitely the rest of the body, right? So using it as a food source. And this is another picture where you can see kind of fence posts in the corner there. So it interspersed among all this faunal was a whole lot of other artifacts too. So we'll see those in future slides, like beads, ceramics. And this is why we think it was a trash pit area where people are just dumping everything that's broken, right? Done with the bone, throw your bones out, throw the broken plate out, all that sort of thing. Okay, again with the organic preservation, it may be a little bit hard to tell from these photos, and I have better pictures of once they've actually been pulled out, but this is birch bark in the unit as it's being excavated. So you can see kind of the frayed edges of what we think is a birch bark bag. This is, again, we have this whole thing might have been, it's made out of leather. I think it's a bag, but I'm not entirely sure because we basically pulled it out and then now it's gone down to the Royal Saskatchewan Museum to be conserved because we're not going to try to like unpack it and unpeel it. Let them do it. The conservators know what they're doing there. Okay, so this is one of the pieces of birch bark bags. I think we have 2 to 3 birch bark bags still in there. You can see the stitching along the edges. Okay. Shoe soles from an adult and from youth, right? Significantly smaller. Maybe a petite woman's, but definitely a lot smaller than this larger leather shoe sole. Okay.
What size were they? I'm just curious, like the adult. Just
I would say like a typical shoe, like men's, like a men's modern shoe size. Maybe it was like a size 10, give or take. This is some of the leather bag. Again, We know it's leather, we know it's all bunched together. If there's anything in it, if it's got any beading or stitching on it, it's for the conservators to do that so they can do it properly. Okay?
So it actually came out intact like that?
It actually came out intact like that. Yeah, we excavated we exposed it, excavated all around it, kind of went under it a little bit just to see how deep it would go, and when we figured out, okay, its footprint is like this, the whole thing comes out in one giant scoop, and immediately into tin foil, and then that's wrapped up and put into cold. Now this was really interesting. This was in another further western section of the site, and I'd love to go back to these units one day. We just didn't have a chance to. Is they came across this bowl, and it's made out of birch bark. And they excavated it out there. They didn't take out anything in the middle because we thought, what happens if there's something in there? It has been proposed it might be a smudge bowl, right? Because in this area of the site we found a lot more indigenous artifacts. So this is where we found a projectile point that would date to that 1700s, 1800s time period. A lot of, I think we found a bone elk pendant or something, some sort of piece of adornment. So we wonder if this was maybe a camp or something like that on that area, so, which is kind of why I want to go back and figure it out more. So again, what's in the bowl? We're not sure yet, because to the conservator it goes, but that's definitely a future area of research there. All right, now getting to Sarah. So we found lots of bones, which is exciting and interesting, and why there's 2 theses devoted to it. But Sarah really wanted to focus on the actual artifacts or the belongings that we excavated from Fort Carlton. And I tend to use belongings and artifacts somewhat interchangeably. Artifacts is very Western scientific method. Belongings, archaeologists are starting to call them that more and more because that's what they are. They were people's belongings, right? They used them, they cared for them. So I mentioned Sarah has a personal connection to the fort. The focus of her research was to better understand the role of Métis women in the fur trade at Fort Carlton, using the archaeological record as well as historical data. She aims to connect the ceramics that was found there and other belongings found to the Métis that we know historically were residing at the fort. In the 75 years of Fort Carlton's existence along the North Saskatchewan River, people lived, camped, worked, traded, and died at the fort. Several indigenous groups also frequented the site. They gave it a Cree name, Pahonanik, which I said means the waiting place. It's safe to assume that the area was used long before it was a Hudson's Bay or even a Northwest Company fort. Although it was situated at the heart of Cree territory, both the Assiniboine and the Unitseton, or the Stone Nations in present-day northern British Columbia, also frequently visited this area. So we have a long indigenous history there. Employees of the fort and their families often lived both inside and outside the palisade walls. Employees hired by the HBC, or the Hudson's Bay Company, were male immigrants coming from Europe, particularly from the Orkney Islands and Scotland. Men from these islands made up the majority of the Hudson's Bay Company staff prior to the merger in 1821. Following that merger, there was an influx of immigrants coming from England, Ireland, and France. However, employees were not limited to those of European descent. You had both indigenous peoples and later Métis who frequently were hired by the company, particularly as hunters, travel guides, and interpreters. Now, the Hudson's Bay Company journals describe relationships that Fort Carlton maintained with indigenous groups in the area. In fact, Mistawasis, who later became Chief Mistawasis, was a hunter and a tracker that worked for the post. A critical group of people that's often left out of the fur trade narrative, especially in journals and documents from that time period, are Métis women. They're only ever referred to as the wives of the male employees, and their contributions have not been recognized. So Sarah felt it was really, really important to include them into her narrative about the fort, as their labor provided really the backbone of the fur trade. The fur trade would not have been successful or existed without the women. Okay. So this is a sampling of some of the belongings that's coming out that Sarah is using in her thesis research. So you've got everything from very utilitarian, everyday items. In the top left, a suspender buckle. You've got beads, pipe fragments, buttons. We really like the beads just because beads are neat. You've got a shell casing here. We had musket balls. This looks like this is a bone handle, maybe off of a piece of cutlery. We've got glass, and we even have metal trade points made out of sheet metal. Two interesting things I want to highlight is the porcelain doll face parts in that top corner there. So obviously there were children, right? You would expect there are families at Fort Carlton. Fur trade records don't talk about children, but they were there. They were part of it as well, and we need to recognize that and talk about that more. So there was some evidence that came out from these excavations with that doll. And we also think we have a cast iron toy, maybe from, I think it's a guy that was sitting on a wagon that would have been pulled by a horse. So that's there too. So there's definitely evidence of children at Fort Carlton. This bottle here, it's a medicine bottle. We found two of them, and it's essence of peppermint. So kind of a cure-all. Heals everything. Full of, all sorts of good stuff you'd never drink or eat today, but it was used snake oil, right? Back in the day. It used to cure everything. So that's really interesting to see as to what people were taking to keep themselves healthy. Okay?
Where would a porcelain doll head come from?
Probably imported from Europe. Yeah. Another interesting thing, the religious iconography found at Fort Carlton. So this were common items that were worn and owned during the fur trade period. Two belongings of this category were recovered during, I think one was in the 2021 excavation. It's that cross there that we think is part of a rosary. And this medallion from 2023 came out in a different area of the excavation. So this is a miraculous medallion. These pieces could have been worn and used by both men and women of European or Métis descent. As Roman Catholics, the Métis would have likely acquired these items from the church, as priests often traveled to the fort. This miraculous medallion, and you can't really see from the picture here, it's a bit washed out, but we've put it under like high-powered microscope so we can actually see that there's an image of there. This was issued by the Roman Catholic Church in 1832 after a French nun known as Sister Catherine Labouré had visions instructing her to have medals struck. So, and you can see from this historic photo here from the Glenbow Archives of Métis women wearing not only medallions, but those rosary crosses as well. Okay. So in total, there were, I think we're in the 20,000 plus in terms of artifact count at this point of just artifacts. The amount of bones coming out, tons more, but we're not interested in the bones. So we have again those buttons at the top, some beads there. 708 beads were collected over the 3 field seasons. A lot of them were seed beads, about 91% were those tiny glass seed beads that you often see in Métis art. But we also have drawn and wound beads as well. The beads ranged in all colors, blues and whites being the most common. And we think we miss a lot more of these seed beads because when you're excavating, they're tiny, right? They're like the size of a pinhead in some cases. If you're not careful and you're troweling your excavation unit, you might miss them. And even though you collect all that dirt and you put it in your bucket and then you screen it, if you don't have a small enough mesh on your screen, they're going to fall through. So once we clued in that, hey, we're getting large quantities of seed beads, we changed our mesh. So then we started to collect more of them. But I'm sure we missed a ton of them. And there's probably even more. So since beadwork is often associated with Métis women, it can be used to indicate possibility of Métis occupation at archaeological sites. There were several other pieces of personal adornment found there. Among these included smaller pieces such as earrings, which Sarah proposes was worn by Métis women. We have tinkle cones, right, from metal that's been rolled, so it would have been added to regalia. We have, this is the bottom of a McKean point, so this would have been a very early 5,000-year-old occupation. I think it got pulled up by the gophers from a deeper layer, so there's a much older occupation at Fort Carlton prior to the historic fur trade. Tons of pipe fragments, and then these are broken, what we call trade rings. And I know the museum here has lovely examples of trade rings that would have been worn by people during the fur trade. So with the tinkling cones, they're often associated with First Nations ornamentation, but the Métis may have used these for trade, or they may simply also just represent a visit from kin members, First Nations kin. Okay? And we'll get on to Sarah's ceramics, which she really fell in love with. So she does something that I've never seen done in other archaeological reports on ceramics. She takes the sherds that she finds, she matches it to a pattern, and then she takes a picture of the sherd on that pattern. And it's like, well, that just makes a ton of sense to do that. Then you totally understand where that piece is coming from. And so that is all her. So good on her for coming up with that. So she found a total of 1,628 earthenware sherds, and then some smaller fragments of porcelain and crockery. Many of the patterns she identifies here, these are all Spode Copeland patterns identified by Lynn Sussman, very common in historic sites in Canada from the Hudson's Bay Company. Spode Copeland was kind of like their main supplier out of England for fur trade ceramics. Of those 1,600 sherds, she was only able to identify a pattern on 308 of them. So she tried. Now, a lot of the ceramic pieces that were found, some of them, they're just white. Don't know what it is, can't tell what the pattern is. But she went through them all, and she matched as much as she could. So 577 were categorized as unidentifiable white due to an absence of color, pattern, or back stamps on it. So she did have some crockery, some stoneware, a little bit of porcelain, but that makes up less than 4% of the total ceramic count at the site. So see, these are some of the Spode Copeland designs that she was able to identify. We have B700, honeysuckle, very common, Brosley, Alhambra, willow, Portland vase. She also found something called spatterware, Portneuf, which has often been associated with Métis occupations. She's been doing a little bit more research into that too. So like at very well-known Métis occupation sites such as Buffalo Lake in Alberta, Petiteville, Chimney Coulee, you will often see a lot of this Portneuf materials there. So she was able to identify many patterns. Sussman actually looked at what Anthony Renier had excavated in the 60s, and she put together this book of like known fur trade sites in Canada and listed 12 patterns coming from Fort Carlton according to Renier's work. Sarah's now added to that. She's found, I think, another 5 on top of it. So she's increased definitely what we know about what's going on there. I think she's done a lot of work into the background of where the non-spode Copeland patterns are coming from. So you do have some Scottish manufacturers coming in. I think we even have some Irish ones. And interestingly enough, in 2023, they were excavating in that smaller area with the compressed floor, and they found a ceramic, and we looked into it a bit, and it's a commemorative plate of I think it was a marshal that served in the Boer War. And it's like, well, how does that get there, right? Lord Roberts, Field Marshal Lord Roberts. It was commemorated for his involvement in the Boer War. There are several variations of this design on plates and other wares. So Lord Roberts, who lived from 1832 until 1914, was a distinguished soldier and one of the most successful commanders of the Victorian era. My idea is how this piece of Boer War memorabilia got to Fort Carlton. That's right around the time Morton was in the area. I think maybe he was having lunch and his plate broke. And he left the shirts there, and might got it added into it, because it's definitely much later than all the other material that has been coming out. Dating for many of the artifacts and belongings, it's really hard because we're dealing with a compressed time span of like first occupation of Fort Carlton, Phase 1, 1810, last 1885. So many things overlap in their time ranges. So trying to determine where the excavated belongings fit into that timeline has been really difficult. And even because we haven't been able to determine specific buildings and tie them to specific phases, I think we're in the 1850s kind of area, but I don't know if Sarah agrees with me or has been able to confirm that yet. So we'll see what she comes up with on that. Okay. So I thought I'd throw in her graphs just because she would want me to. So what did she do here? I pulled notes from her thesis. So as I mentioned, a total of 1,628 earthenware sherds were recovered from them. This is a listing of all the ones she's been able to identify, which is actually more than her additional 5 and Lynn Sussman's 12. You can see here the breakdown. The majority of what she's got is like there's a pattern but not enough of it for her to identify, or it's completely white, she can't tell at all at 35%, and only 19% of the total was identified. So there's so much more information out there, it's just we can't access it. Okay? This is another thing that's uniquely Sarah. So along with identifying the pattern, she came up with 2 pattern reconstruction illustrations based on sherds found at the site as well as other fur trade sites. So the first pattern she's able to create a reconstruction of is the gem pattern by Samuel Barker and Son. She has 47 sherds at Fort Carlton from those excavations. She went through everything that's been written on Samuel Barker and Son's gem pattern, could not find a complete picture of it. So it's this one right here. She took her sherds and she actually sat and extrapolated from those sherds what an entire plate would look like. And again, it's just, wow, that's beautiful. She's also done it on this one, and all she's got is this tiny little 2 pieces here. This is all that's been published on this particular pattern. This is J and MP Bell and Company, and so we have it identified at a few other fur trade sites in Western Canada, but obviously not enough to really go on. But she took what they had done, what she had, and she started a reconstruction on it. It's an unknown pattern name, so it's only known as the J and MP Bell pattern, Bell Company pattern. In terms of what she's got, obviously plates there, but teacups and saucers too. And according to historians and other research, Métis women were known to be substantial tea drinkers. This is observed and supported by the archaeological record with the presence of teacup and saucer sherds, as well as discarded lead foil that tea was often shipped in. David Burley, who's a Canadian archaeologist and specializes in the fur trade era sites, notes that tea drinking and the tea service was largely a social affair. Métis women used this European tradition to demonstrate hospitality and their social status as well. So many plate sherds were found at Fort Carlton. However, due to the size of the pieces that were recovered, she could only tell. We definitely have some teacups, we have some saucers, and some larger plates, but more than that, if there's bowls or platters, we're not entirely sure. Okay, so Indigenous women. So Sarah says there are definitely artifacts that indicate the presence of women at the site, but she's also wanted to start delving into more historical records for the period. One she was able to turn to was James Carnegie's, the 9th Earl of Southwest's works, which is called Saskatchewan and the Rocky Mountains, a diary and narrative of travel, sport, and adventure during a journey through the Hudson's Bay Company territories in 1859 and 1860. And this is where he documents his journey west, which included a stop at Fort Carlton. He details his encounters with the Indigenous women at the fort and describes their, quote, knack for embroidery and beading. He also goes on to describe Fort Carlton as a large palisaded enclosure about a quarter mile from the river, which had been cleared of wood immediately behind the buildings, which again fits with everything we know. However, he says that this clearance was made entirely by Indigenous women under the direction of Mr. Hardesty, an employee of the fort, for the men, quote, counted it disgraceful to do anything in the shape of labor, end quote. Nice. Carnegie also describes his interactions with a Mrs. Tait at Fort Carlton. So while living at the fort, the women would have been responsible for an endless list of other tasks, in not only brush clearing, but in addition to caring for their home and children. Fort Carlton was a well-known fur depot and provisioning post. Women were in charge of butchering, drying meat, cleaning hides, and preparing pemmican. Some of this would be used for their own families, but most was sold to the fort. Following a hunting trip Southwest took with some Carleton men, he recounts that they were plentifully supplied with meat, which the Carleton women were engaged in drying for them. The following morning, he records seeing a party of women, wives, and daughters washing clothes near the river. The women were also responsible for most of the gardening, cooking, and cleaning. They cut wheat and barley, so they had agriculture at Fort Carlton, harvested vegetables, picked berries, stacked hay, got reeds for thatching, and made moccasins and clothing. And the children would have assisted in many of these tasks as well, which makes you wonder, what really did the men do at Fort Carlton? Among the women residing at Fort Carlton was a relative of Sarah's, Mary Monkman Tait, is the only women for which she could find detailed written records of at Fort Carlton in Carnegie's journals. She was also the sole artist whose name was recorded by Carnegie during his travels to Saskatchewan and the Rocky Mountains. While not recovered from Fort Carlton itself, portions of the Southwest collection, which I think are mostly in the Glenbow Museum in Calgary now, these tell us a lot and give us important insight into the daily lives and roles of women in the fur trade and at Fort Carlton. So in 1859, Carnegie left Fort Garry in Manitoba on a hunting expedition in search of exotic animals. He took it upon himself during his travels to collect objects made by First Nation and Métis individuals. These objects include things such as garments and accessories, weaponry, and horse gear. Many of these pieces were commissioned for his own personal use, but several were sent back home to relatives in Scotland. The connection to Mary is one through Sarah's Pocha side. Mary Monkman was born in 1832. She was the daughter of Nancy Chaboyer and James Monkman. She married Philip Tait in 1852. Now, Philip was the son of William Tait and Mary Bear. Another son of William and Mary was James Tait, who married Margaret Pocha. Margaret's parents were Joseph Paquin, or Pocha, and Marie Lapointe, her 5 times great-grandparents. Sarah notes that even though my relation is a distant one through marriage several generations ago, it just goes to show how interconnected Métis families were and still are today. Now back to Mrs. Tait, Mary Monkman Tait. We know that she had a, quote, knackery for embroidery and needlework, and she was a highly skilled needleworker. Southwest took it upon himself to have her do some sewing for him. Among these projects included a few pairs of slipper-style moccasins made of deer and caribou hide. Southwest describes this style of moccasin with its small vamps and pointed toes as a characteristic of Saskatchewan style of dress. And this is a picture from his collection of some of those moccasins. So the thistle design on one pair, the top left, showcases Mary Monkman Tait's skill and creativity. At the time of creation, the Scottish thistle had not yet reached Western Canada. Although Mary's family on her father's side was from England, she could have been familiar with the design through representations on other goods, such as fabrics and ceramics. So Scottish-inspired fashion had reached the height of popularity in the 1850s. In creating this design, Mary not only made a place with her own artistic flair, but she also appealed to Southwest's national pride. So that is one of the big things Sarah's been able to do, is to trace her own familial lineage through it. In her thesis, she does mention another woman. I'm not sure if she's finished that research yet, but she's definitely got that connection to the fort. And I think that's what makes her research for her thesis so special, is she started out as a field school student, just trying her hand at archaeology, seeing if she liked it, back in 2021. And I could tell, right? Tim and I could both tell, like, this girl's got fire. We like her, you know. She's smart, she's capable, she doesn't put up with anything. And then she started to tell us about her family, and like, oh yeah, I used to come to Fort Carlton all the time as a kid. We would jig here and go on circuits doing Métis jigging and things like that. And it's like, well, Sarah, have you ever considered doing a master's degree, you know, and looking more into Fort Carlton and looking into these artifacts? And I don't think it was very hard to convince her, because I think she really started to feel that kinship with the belongings that were coming out of the fort as well. And I'm so happy that she's been able to pursue this research and draw in that familial connection. And when she comes back, she'll tell you more about the types of theory. She weaves indigenous archaeology with feminist archaeology throughout her thesis, and it's very exciting what she's done overall. So I'm happy that I was able to tell you a little bit, give you a sneak peek at what she's done today. So that's what I have for you today. I'm happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability. I just received a new draft of Sarah's thesis. I haven't been able to go through it yet, so, but I can do my best if you have any questions on her research. Thank you.